Welcome to day 3 of the National Press Foundation Widening the Pipeline Fellowship Program. We've had several days of intensive conversations about the nuts and bolts of what it will take for young journalists of color like you to navigate this fast-evolving media landscape currently. And as I've said several times, the goal is to give you the tools to still be in this industry if that's what you want to be 10 years from now or 20 years from now. Some of the best speakers that we've had and the most insightful ones have been those who've talked about their immigrant experience in entering the media realm and navigating that scenario. And certainly yesterday's conversation with Yen-Chi Hsu of the Flatwater Free Press, who was literally thrust into the spotlight based on her nationality in Nebraska. The insights on what it has taken to sort of survive and thrive in that setting has been quite helpful to me. Today, we are quite privileged to hear from a journalist who brings that sensibility into his reporting and coverage as an anchor with CNN. But more importantly, he's really going to help us drill deep on this issue of the why. Why are we doing what we do? And what is it that we hope to obtain and accomplish? And so it's my great privilege to introduce all of you to Boris Sanchez of CNN, my new best friend.
We are kindred spirits.
We are. We do have a lot in common. Thank you so much for joining us today.
Yeah, it is my pleasure. I'm privileged to be here, and I hope I can live up to that aspiration that you laid out there that I was going to.
I think you can. And I'd like to start with what I thought was quite poignant. You came to America on your 3rd birthday.
Yeah.
And your family came from Cuba to Miami. Let's start there.
Yeah. So it's a long and convoluted story, a journey, but it's intricate and integral to why I became a journalist. The long and short of it is that my grandfather was a political prisoner in Cuba. He, as a young man, saw many of his friends get beat up in the street and incarcerated and disappeared because they opposed the dictator that was in place in Cuba at the time, a guy by the name of Fulgencio Batista. And so seeing the situation as it was, my grandfather started sneaking people out of the country. He worked on cruise ships that went from Havana to Nassau to Miami. And so his friends that were involved in the anti-Batista movement, he got them as stowaways on the ship and got them out in Miami, where there was a growing group of people that were revolutionaries that wanted to remake Cuba. Because for many years, the leadership in Cuba had been a puppet for interests of the U.S. government, the mafia, Big Sugar, etc. And Cubans felt as though it wasn't a country of their own. In that, my grandfather got caught and had to sneak off into Miami, and then he joined this group. He goes back to Cuba, winds up in the mountains with a beret and a beard and an old Thompson shotgun. And January 1st, 1959, they overtake Havana. And Batista flees the country, and it's a new day. It's a new dawn for Cuba. In that process, things went a direction that my grandfather did not appreciate or support. And so when Fidel Castro took power and turned out to be much like the previous dictator and his authoritarian methods, my grandfather said, let's do it again. He went back to the mountains. This time it didn't work out. He got caught and he got sentenced to 20 years in prison. Essentially, at that point, it was for speaking his mind. It was for organizing. He hadn't even grabbed a weapon to launch another revolution. So, fast forward 2 generations, I'm a little kid sitting with my grandfather and my dad and others at a domino table when I was like 7 years old during Christmas parties and, birthdays, Nochebuena, etc. There's like faint salsa music in the background and there's a pig roasting and we're playing dominoes and I'm hearing these stories and I'm hearing them talk about history and politics and things that I could tell were very emotionally charged and significant to them. And I desperately wanted to be part of that conversation. I desperately wanted to impress them with my ideas. I had my own ideas, and I was 7 years old. You can imagine what those ideas were, right? So Case in point, part of the reason that I wanted to do TV journalism specifically is because around that time, I used to watch the local news in Miami. It was the Simpsons, and then the local news, and then In Living Color. That was my every night ritual. And on the local news, there was an anchor who shared my last name. His last name was Sanchez. And I thought, oh my God, what if we're related to this guy? So I asked my dad, I was like, Dad, like, do you know him? And my dad lied and said, yes, that's your uncle. We don't really talk to him much, but yeah. And I thought, my fake uncle has the coolest job in the world. He tells stories for a living. He informs the community. And then hand in hand with that, my mom, as we talked about on the phone, from a very young age, had aspired to write. She wanted to write for a newspaper or a magazine. She had an aptitude for it, but of course, it being Cuba, the government determines so much of your life. And she was sent to work at a tin can factory, and that dream got put aside. So knowing all of this, being a little kid, watching all of this unfold, it was something that was second nature to me at that point. The desire to be involved in that conversation and the dialogue about politics, and also this sort of love for writing and storytelling and presentation. I also wanted to do a lot of other things. I wanted to play basketball. I wanted to be a spy. That never happened. So suffice to say, the Miami Heat never came calling. The CIA wanted nothing to do with me. So eventually, when it came time to decide where I was going to go to high school, there was a local magnet program that had a TV studio. And my parents essentially said, you're not going to high school with the same friends that you went to middle school with, because I was rambunctious and such. And I was like, well, I'll go and learn TV. So I did that. I grew up very humble. So when it came time to look at colleges, I grew up with my dad fading my hair in our backyard, sitting on cement bags with like 2 or 3 rusted cars in the backyard, because he was a mechanic, and on the side, to make ends meet, he would do his own work for people in the neighborhood and his friends. So, I got accepted to schools that I looked at and I was like, well, who's going to pay for this? My parents helped my sister get her education. Hey, good morning. And so they kind of looked at me and they were like, all right, scholarships, this is very important. So I pursued them. I was fortunate in that I got a scholarship from a local school, Miami-Dade College. And I went to a counselor as I was getting ready to finish. And I said, what's the best journalism school in the country? And they told me Syracuse University, the SI Newhouse School of Public Communications. So I was like, all right, let's see what happens. I applied, and I still remember sitting there holding, because when you get accepted, you get the big envelope. If you don't, it's the small envelope, right? So I was sitting there, I knew I was holding the big envelope, and it was just like, the feeling of just that euphoria. So then a more complicated, convoluted story that I'm sure we'll get into. From that moment of being 7 years old and aspiring to be part of that conversation, fast forward 25 years, I'm at the White House standing in front of the president, and he's pointing at me, inviting me to question him. The same thing that my grandfather was incarcerated for. It gives me all the feelings, even as I say it out loud. And believe me, I've talked to a lot of young journalists. I've told this story many times, and every time I tell it, I still get that feeling, because it is my why. It is the reason that throughout my career, I have faced obstacles. I have faced apathy from news directors that maybe don't care about the stories that I'm pitching. I have faced, let's say, typecasting, where someone sees you a certain way and they think you fit in a box and they want you to fit in that box. And if you try to get out of that box, it's, we don't see you that way, is what they say, right? So the reason I was really excited to talk to you today, to share my why, is because I believe we're at an inflection point, not just as a country and as a democracy, but in journalism. I was fortunate to go to my alma mater, Syracuse, last week to speak to students. And one of the things that I was told is that more and more the students that have been going to that journalism school, which is fantastic, want to get into sports. In their freshman class, some 80 to 90% of the students have expressed more interest in sports than in news. And that, to me, it's great if you want to pursue sports. That's lovely. But it worries me that specifically for people of color, it's becoming more and more difficult to enter into news. With inflation the way it is, with those entry-level jobs not paying very much. I mean, when I started, I had very big student loans. You can imagine giving you a description of what my upbringing was like. I had to take out massive loans to be able to afford Syracuse and to complement those scholarships. And I got shipped out to a tiny TV station in Redding, California, market 130 million, it felt like, where I was doing everything at that station. I was a one-man band. I was carrying the camera. I was running the teleprompter. I was fixing the IT. I felt like the custodian at that station, cleaning up other people's messes. And I was making $17,000 a year in California, where registering your car alone is like $200. It was back then in 2010. I don't want to imagine what it's like now. So how do you survive in a situation where you have to choose between eating and ignoring the 40 phone calls you get a day from banks and your mom, because she's also getting those phone calls because she co-signed those loans? And side note, I think it's ridiculous that when a student takes out a loan like this and they have someone co-sign for them, even if the student dies, their parents still have to pay back those loans for a degree that may not even be competitive in the marketplace. Don't get me started on that, right? I'm sure many of you young journalists perhaps are facing the student loan conundrum yourselves. So with that sort of overview of why I'm here and why I find it to be so special to share this moment with you, I'm ready to take questions.
He's a reminder that we are our ancestors' wildest dreams, right? Like, seriously. I mean, I told him about the fact that my mother, when she was growing up, when she got to high school, they gave her an IQ test, and she scored 140 on that high IQ test. And so, but her parents wanted to marry her off, and so she wound up having 10 kids. I'm the ninth. And she always wanted to write. And she would send letters to the editor, to the local newspaper, to Ebony and Jet magazine, and of course never got published. So quite literally, I feel like every time I do something like this, I'm doing it for Miss Eloise. So it's a powerful imagery of you and your grandfather in that moment at the White House.
Absolutely. Yeah, I couldn't believe it. It was surreal.
Our last speaker yesterday talked about strategies, being strategic. So what strategies did you use to keep your energy level up and your focus when you were inundated with these bills and with these calls and with all these other external pressures that had nothing to do with the news per se?
I guess specifically in that phase of my career where I questioned not whether it was what I wanted to do, but whether fundamentally it made sense for me to do it, it was digging into that sort of resilience, digging into, as you noted, my ancestors' wildest dreams. I can share with you that we're human. And so we have a tendency, naturally as social creatures, to compare ourselves to others. So to catch you up from Syracuse to how I got this first job, I made a resume tape in college, and it was terrible. I had earrings, and I was like, bro, the fire started here. And then, so when I back at the time, you still mailed DVDs. It wasn't yet YouTube links that were the preferred method of getting your tape out there. So I made like 30 DVDs, sent them all out. All I got back was a small envelope from a station, I believe it was either Alabama or Mississippi, and it was essentially, thanks, but we want nothing to do with it. So I was fortunate to get an internship. I did dual major at Syracuse, so I finished the broadcast journalism degree and thought, now this will get me a job. It didn't right away, but I also was doing international relations, in part because of that desire to have those conversations with my parents and my grandfather when I was a kid. And I was finishing that, and I was able to, in that phase, get an internship at a TV station in Miami and shadow reporters as they were doing their stand-ups and sort of see one-on-one what it was like, and also get a more sort of refined professional taste for presenting yourself in a way that is authentic, but also follows certain mores. In other words, no earrings, right? And so the first link that I sent out with that tape was the first place that responded, and it was Redding, California, middle of nowhere. And I did stories on cows stuck in the middle of the road. I did stories on weird meth crime There's a lot of like, some guy steals a car and drives it into a house, random sort of spot news. It was also great access for local politics, because you could go to a community meeting and there would only be a certain amount of people there. So you could have a conversation with the mayor, the sheriff right away. In a bigger city, that's much more difficult. So there were a ton of stories that I covered there that were fundamental in my shaping as a journalist. But I say this because as I was going through those struggles, as I said, one-man banding and working with faulty equipment and news directors that were more interested in keeping you there than having you grow and potentially leave them. You're cheap labor to them, right? I would see my friends on social media, and they were like in Miami on a boat with all these beautiful people and all this like expensive stuff. And I'm like, I've had enough ramen in the microwave this week. Like, what am I doing? You know, you ask yourself, like, what am I doing? And the reminder to me was the cell that my grandfather spent all those years in. It is tiny. I actually went to Miami last year because they have a museum dedicated to the Cuban diaspora, and they have a replica of one of the exact cells from the prison where my grandfather was kept, called Boniato. And the cell, I kid you not, is roughly from that end of that table to the wall, and he shared it with 3 men, sometimes 4. And because they were political prisoners, they were given different uniforms than the rest of the inmates. And at one point they protested because the other inmates would harass them, and they were told, oh, you don't like the uniforms? We'll take them away. And they were held naked. Naked. Imagine, like, and they were tortured. And I just think about that and I'm like, no, these struggles that I have now, this like, oh, my news director doesn't really help me. I'm making no money. These computers are ancient. They don't really work. Perfect example. When I went to that station, I didn't know this at the time, but they had a serious issue consistently with transmission, getting the signal out from the station to the community. They had one live truck. And in news, to grow for television, you have to be good at going live, going in the middle of nowhere without a script and just making stuff up, right? Not making up information, but rather, just to be clear, before this winds up on a website somewhere, stringing together pieces of information in a narrative that is not only informative, but captivating, right? And serves the viewer. So the one live truck that they had hooked up to the master control room, which is where all the signals are gathered, and there was a cable that ran out through the back door that was left open into the live truck, because the live truck was the only thing that could broadcast the signal to the mountain where the big satellite was that sent our signal out over the entire viewing area. In other words, I had no capacity for going live. It was a rinky-dink operation, to say the least. And I'm thinking, man, did I make the right choice? I mean, I've been ignoring my mom for a week. I've been ignoring the banks for longer. I've been struggling, and then I see my friends and the life that they're living, and I'm like, did I make the right decision? Inevitably, you come to that question, that sort of buyer's remorse. Am I making the right decision? Sort of sliding doors, 2 pathways question. And every time the answer was yes, because it's what I had dreamed about forever. And I knew that in that struggle, I was building resilience. I was building the capacity to face other obstacles along the way. And that being able to overcome those things made me confident that I could overcome even bigger things. The imposter syndrome that comes with going through that process, being an immigrant, being someone that didn't have every opportunity growing up, and then winding up next to the journalists that I used to watch when I was younger at the White House, shoulder to shoulder, competing with them. Not knowing, like, do I have what it takes? Right? Like, that's the other thing. You have to wrestle with your own self-doubt, where in, weird moments late at night after you've made a mistake, after you've mispronounced something, after you've not done as well as you had hoped on a live shot or missed a story, I would lose sleep. I would be staring at the ceiling, and then that sort of doubt would creep into your ear, and that whisper that's like poison. Am I good enough? But fundamentally, having gone through those obstacles early on, gave me confidence. Repetition is the father of learning. That's something I learned from Lil Wayne. I kid you not. I kid you not. And it's true that repetition, that failure, and that dealing with obstacles over and over, you come to see the obstacles as gifts, as opportunities. And after a lot of self-delusion, I convinced myself that not only was I capable, but that there was no other choice for me. I was going to succeed or I was going to die. I know that's very dramatic, but that's how I felt at the time. That's what I had to tell myself at the time in order to get up at 3 o'clock in the morning to go to this station where it felt like everything that I did was, not really valued, to be honest.
This is such an important conversation to be having before they attend the annual awards dinner tonight. They were asking what to expect. And I think Boris is modeling for all of us that superstar you see on CNN had the same struggles you're having right now. Very few of them did not go through and think about folks who went through it in 1975 or like me in the 80s when we didn't have half the tools that you all have and we didn't have half of the technology or whatever.
Or the example of others.
Or the example of others.
Who have blazed a trail for you.
I've been the first black woman or black person in most of the early newsrooms that I started out in. And so I depended on hearing stories about people like Bobby Bowman and the Metro 7 and Dorothy Gilliam, who will also be meeting tonight. And that helped me to say, they survived, they got through it, so I need to woman up. I need to pull myself together and get through this. But when you see somebody tonight across the room and it's like, oh my God, remember, they could be just as approachable and nice and warm and human as Boris is. If you put all of this stuff in your head about who they are, who she is, and how she may not be nice to you, then you could be missing out on the opportunity of a lifetime. I could ask questions all day, so let's start opening it up here.
Good morning. Thank you so much for speaking with us. I'm Kayla Sharp from Bloomberg Government. And my question is, what do you think needs to happen to make journalism more equitable? We've seen a big push recently for newsrooms, but also other employers to start paying their interns for the work that they do so that they can afford to do those internships. We also saw during COVID that so many newsrooms had such a boost in internship applications because they were remote. And students from across the country were able to apply and be qualified for those positions without having to move to a high cost of living area like DC or New York or LA. So short of another global pandemic, what other things do you think need to happen that we as future and emerging newsroom leaders need to keep in mind as we try to shape the future of this industry?
That's a very good question. I think it's a very difficult question to answer, in part because it is one issue, a very significant issue out of many that the news industry is trying to navigate, the well-meaning news industry is trying to navigate right now. Fundamentally, part of the answer has to be economic. There has to be some sort of incentive as newsrooms restructure and as we're watching this sort of disruptive environment that we're in reshape the news industry altogether. There must be a way to find incentive in newsrooms for different communities' voices to be heard. And part of that is an organic but also coordinated alliance between people in different communities that have similar interests that want to bring attention to stories. I'll give you an example. For 4, maybe 5 years now, I have been incessantly pitching stories about the Latina electorate and how it can influence elections, right? Not just in South Florida, but in places like Wisconsin, which in 2020 went for President Biden by only about 20,000 votes. It doesn't take a lot to imagine a scenario in which former President Trump is making inroads with Latino voters. Certain Latino voters are trending more conservative, in which a very tiny population of Latinos in Wisconsin could shape where that state goes, and that could be a pivotal state in the election. So I've been pitching those stories now for years. That's the current sort of pitch. It was somewhat different back then, but I've been pitching those stories, and those emails gathered dust and cobwebs, and it was like, But in part because the story gathered more national attention, and in part because other outlets started paying more attention to that story because they had journalists of color that were pitching those stories, and I'm allied with them as we network, we're friends, we talk. When they send me their pitches or they send me their stories, the innate competitive nature of a news organization sees that and says, why don't we have that? Well, I've been pitching that story for 5 years. I'm more than happy to get shot out of a cannon to go do it right now. So having those kinds of alliances, having those voices, having people fighting to give those kinds of stories airtime is critical. But again, there's that unanswered question of what does the economy of journalism look like, not just now in the age of social media in the near term, but once you have really good artificial intelligence that I would never say could do a journalist's job, but could do a decent enough imitation that certain people will be okay with it. So I hope that gives you some perspective of what I think the answer could be. If I had the answer, I'd be very, very wealthy. For sure. Yeah.
Pass it down to...
Hi, I'm Kishi Young from PBS NewsHour. We've been talking a lot about our why in journalism, and a huge part of my why is covering communities that have historically felt ignored or just not seen by the media. My question is, what advice do you have for reporters who work for a national audience? How do we accurately represent communities that have been ignored by us, And at all times, of course during an important year like 2024.
Do you happen to work with someone named Jeff Bennett?
I love Jeff Bennett. Yes, he used to be our teacher before he moved over to Weekday.
Yeah.
I'm on the weekend team.
Yeah. So Jeff is a good friend. We worked at the White House together, and that's part of my answer. It goes back to sort of building those alliances and networking, because you may be aware of the significance of a story, but if you're in a newsroom that is of a certain build, you may pitch that story endlessly, but if the decision makers don't share perhaps that background or that perspective, or appreciate why that story that doesn't fall in what you would call the mainstream, they don't appreciate why that's significant, then you're just throwing into the void. But if you have another voice there, if you have someone who's doing important work somewhere else and makes you aware of it and allows you to present it to someone and say, look at what they're doing, this is impactful, this is important, you can see why they're doing the story. It allows that sort of competitive instinct in that decision maker to arise. And that, I have found, has been the most successful way of getting those stories out there. You may be in a position where you don't necessarily have that ally or the news, the source that's putting together that information doesn't necessarily appeal to that competitive edge that you want a news director or a decision maker to have. What I would suggest is that you have to give them an incentive. Like, they have to see something that makes them think, oh, we got to do this, otherwise we're going to be missing out on something, or this is going to make us stand out. That you can't, and this is true of many things, most often in a sort of corporate atmosphere, appealing to a sense of morality doesn't go as far as appealing to personal incentive or collective incentive, right? And then one thing that I alluded to there that actually also answers the last question, finding a news organization that values not only diversity in front of the camera or at the ground level, but at the executive level is huge, because it's in that room that you don't get to enter, where that conversation happens, where the decisions are made, that you want that voice. I'm so fortunate at CNN to have champions that not only brought me into the network and nurtured me, but still advocate for me and for others like me, so that you sort of build a community that's integrated to the entire company, but also fosters an awareness and a community, an alliance of like-minded people. And that, I think, is huge. So when you're looking at potential openings, that's a good question to ask when you're sitting there with an interviewer. What do the decision makers look like? Do they reflect what the community looks like?
Aditi and then Brad.
Hey, Boris. Hey. Nice to have you here. My name is Aditi. I work for CNN in New York. You talked about how the stakes were, I'm going to do this or die. And that's a lot of pressure on you.
For sure.
And maybe not the exact same sentence, but as an immigrant who came here to make a name for myself in the business, I do identify with the pressure of it a lot. So I guess I just want to ask you what may sound like a two-part question, which is, can you describe a time when you were in another stage of your career and, you had to figure out what needed to come next? How did you identify that? And two, how did you pitch that to perhaps your employer, or when you found that that employer is not in your corner, to another one?
Sure. There have actually been multiple stages, and you wouldn't qualify your parents as an employer, but I imagine that some of that pressure that you're describing also comes from your parents, because immigrant parents, look, in my neighborhood in Miami-Dade County, it's called Hialeah. It's a suburb of Miami. There are chickens that run around. And you wonder, why are there chickens running around? It's because people keep chickens because they have this generational trauma that someday the government is going to show up and take everything. So they have chickens just in case something goes wrong. If one day, the grocery store shuts down, they have a chicken or chickens and they can make eggs, they can, So that mentality is with you forever. It's what am I going to do if this goes wrong? There's constantly that voice. You can imagine what it's like to be 19 years old, going to your parents. It was the day I graduated from Miami-Dade College, the community school, and saying, okay, in my head, this was basically what I was going to tell them. Okay, listen, I need $120,000 because I'm going to go put on clown shoes and a big red nose. I want to be a clown. I want to be in the circus. And that's what I imagine, they're going to be like, what are you talking about? Why don't you do something sane? Why don't you engineering, medicine, etc.? You feel that. But fortunately, when I told them I have this dream and this is what I want to do and I need a lot of money to do it, would you sign on the form? They were extremely supportive. What I would say is that you have to build a compelling case when you want to switch roles, or how do I explain this? When you're trying to appeal to a decision maker for a new role, you have to build a compelling case, and part of that is two factors. One of them is specialization. So get really, really good at something, whatever it is. If you know everything that there is to know about the Fulton County case against Donald Trump. Today's a big day in court. We have 5 names that we can go to because we know that they know every rock has been lifted, every grain examined, and that person is an expert on the story, and they could talk about it as I'm talking to you now off the cuff, right? They don't need to look down at a script. They don't need to read a teleprompter. They can just go. And the second part of that is make sure that everybody in the newsroom knows that that's you and associates you with that, so that when the door on a plane blows off midair, the first person you think of is Pete Muntean. He's our aviation correspondent, right? When something happens in the Middle East, the first person you think of as an analyst, not just a correspondent that's on the ground, but as an analyst, is this person who's covered it for 30 years. And part of the reason that they've covered it is they have a passion for it, they've studied it, et cetera, et cetera. So specialize in something and then advertise it until people get tired of hearing you advertise that that's what you're interested in, and also that you have competence in. That's important. And then if you're met with resistance, as I've been before, or you're met with someone who says, we don't really see you that way. As I was describing before, it's human nature to pursue incentive over morality. it's also human nature to value something more when you see how other people value it. Leverage. In other words, when you go into a station or a network at an entry-level position, some folks will see you as that forever. Even as you get better, you may surprise them, they may see you in different ways, but you will constantly be fighting the perception that you were homegrown, because as is natural, it's not, I don't think it's something nefarious. I think as is natural, they're sort of used to you, and they see you the way that you made a first impression. And even if you break that over time, it still kind of lingers in their mind. When they see other folks at other networks, they don't necessarily see that struggle or that sort of growth phase. They just see the finished product for the most part. So they kind of value them differently. There's something about what's far away being attractive as opposed to what's here that I think is kind of innate in human nature, mostly because you fill the void of ignorance with whatever fantasy you have in a funny way. Nevertheless, if you present yourself to other potential employers or people in the industry, and again, you build alliances, it's much harder for them to sort of relegate you or mitigate you, because they see the value that others see in you, and then that increases your value to them. They say, well, why would you go over there? Aren't you happy here? And you're like, well, I've been telling you that I want to do X, Y, and Z, and I feel stunted in my inability to do it here. So either give me the opportunity, or maybe there's a future for me somewhere else. And part of that is also having an awareness of what's going on in other places, which again goes back to my networking thing of building alliances and making friends across the industry.
Sorry, if I could just also have you answer the identifying your next stage thing. Like, how did you go about step by step? Like,
how do you mean? Oh, okay. So what I would say is that's actually a really good kind of tactical question. You have to have not just mentors, but people that you really respect and almost idolize in a way. I hesitate to use that word, but that you like aspire to be like. You should consider finding a person whose style and whose presence you like, and then deconstructing how they got those skills. So if you see someone like Mike Wallace to me is like the saint of journalism. He's hilarious. So you watch some of the interviews that he did. He's no longer with us. I work with his son Chris now, who is amazing and hilarious. Every time I talk to him is a joyous interaction. But you watch someone like that and you see him interview world figures, and everyone from world figures to sports icons to newsmakers, and just the way that he comports himself, the way that he navigates the conversation. Some of that is innate. Some of that he was unquestionably born with or raised with, but it's also skill that he's rehearsed and that he's done. Repetition is the father of learning, that he's done again and again and again. So what I would say is, when you see that person, when you see that mentor and you deconstruct how they got to where they are, it sort of illuminates a staircase for you of steps. Where did they go that they got those skills, right? I was at a crossroads when I was finishing my time in Redding, California. My contract was basically ending. I felt like I had outgrown that station. I was frustrated and bored because I felt like it wasn't challenging, and I felt like I'm ready to go somewhere else. So I auditioned for a station in Miami, hometown. It was weekend anchoring. The pay was significantly more than I was making in Redding. My family's there, the sunshine, the beach, the boats, the Miami Heat, forever my heart. And I also auditioned for a station in Denver, Colorado. Didn't know anybody there, had never been there, freezing. What else? I don't know. It's not Miami, basically, right? And then I had to decide. It was actually less money than the Miami job. It was also weekend anchoring, but it was less money than the Miami job. And then I had to decide, all right, so do I go home or do I sort of take this kind of weird path? And then what I asked myself was, which will have more value long term? What skills will be required of me at the end of my What skills will be required for me to develop so that by the end of my contract, I will be a more polished product looking for the next thing? Because again, the staircase doesn't end in Miami for me. The staircase ends more or less where I am now. There's still more steps to go. But I decided to go to Denver because the viewer in Denver is more sophisticated than the viewer in Miami. The viewer in Denver, it was true when I was there. I don't know if it's true now, but they have the highest capita of high school and college graduates in Denver. It's a microcosm of the country. The stations there put together stories, like actual stories with characters. Writing is, you need to be a good writer to succeed working in Denver. In Miami, I grew up in Miami. I know it well. I love it. And I love the news market down there. But it's literally standing in front of yellow tape. And you say, we're standing in front of yellow tape. There's blood on the ground. There are sirens. I talked to a neighbor who said they've never seen anything like this. Cue soundbite. I've never seen anything like this. You come back. We're going to keep watching the situation. We'll get back to you with the very latest. And that is it. If it bleeds, it leads. It's every night. And the number one station since I was a kid watching the anchorman Sanchez on the news has been the number one station because that's what they do. So what skills am I going to develop there? I may be able to go live, but I'd go live doing what? We're standing in front of yellow tape. And so I looked at CNN, for example, other networks, and I was like, where did those people work? Where did they come from? Denver, DC, newspapers. CNN hires journalists that have never done TV, as you well know. Jeff Zeleny, Caitlin Collins, Abby Phillip, right? Those are folks that worked for newspapers or blogs, but they were experts in their field. And so what CNN did was say, we want experts. So we'll cultivate the TV part. That part, it's not easy. I would never say that it's easy. But that part, we can get you further along than we can take a local news reporter in Miami and teach them about politics. Mm-hmm. And that's also part of where my insecurity came. Because when I got to the White House, it was like, so, you know, I was talking about specialization before. So when I was in Redding is part of the Emerald Triangle in Northern California, which means that they grow a ton of marijuana at like a disproportionate amount to the rest of the country. I did a bunch of stories there about marijuana. One of them was huge for me. I did an investigative 3-part series on undocumented migrants from Mexico creating these massive illegal marijuana grows on national park forest land, and the sheriff being like overwhelmed, like, I have one deputy overnight the entire weekend. We're going to go against the cartel, like, Godspeed, right? So that was huge for me. And then when I got to Denver, one of my very first big stories was the Amendment 64 issue. And on election night in 2012, I was at the Amendment 64, the pro-Amendment 64 party. Amendment 64 legalized recreational marijuana in Colorado. It was the first state in the country to do so. And so when I was there, people were going crazy. It was nuts. And I realized, like, this is an opportunity because a lot of the other reporters on my station are older. This is a younger demographic. They are not necessarily sharp with social media. They don't necessarily see the implications of what this issue is going to mean for the community. Because it's not just that you're legalizing marijuana, it's also a zoning issue, it's an educational issue, it's a political issue, it's an economic issue. And so I saw an opportunity. I was like, this is going to be my beat. So I took all these cards, I got all of this information, and I wound up being the pot reporter. Anytime there was a new pot story, it was me. They associated me with pot, which is not necessarily, when you go on to bigger things, what you want to be associated with, right? But so I started to differentiate myself later on. But it was the fact that it wasn't necessarily the content. It was the fact that I owned a beat. And that the ability to do that is invaluable. So I forgot where I was in the...
No, we can listen to you all day, so don't worry.
Yeah. Well, we should move on. Yeah.
But I want to keep you on schedule. Let's go to Bradford and then Fernanda.
Hey, Boris, thank you so much for coming through today. There's something that you shared that really...
Introduce yourself.
Oh, sorry. Bradford Davis. I'm based in New York. I'm independent currently. But there's something that you said that piqued my interest because you mentioned your concern about young minority journalists being primarily funneled into, or maybe funneled is too strong a word, but certainly
Typecast.
Yeah, typecast as sports, journalists, right? And you wanting to expand, expand, I guess, the vision possibility for sports, or excuse me, for young minority, especially I assume black and brown, journalists to pursue other sorts of coverages within the wide world of journalism media. It resonates with me a lot because I actually, I was a sports columnist for New York Daily News, years ago, and I moved to, the world of investigative reporting, through that. And so I guess one of my questions is, without making it too individualized for myself, but hopefully, for everyone watching, is, do you, for those who are currently in the world of sports media, who either aspire to more in that, or perhaps more outside of it, do you have any suggestions, about ways that they can, make those transitions so that they do not remain typecast in that world?
Yeah, absolutely. I think sadly, a byproduct of what I was alluding to earlier in promoting stories about a specific community or certain kinds of stories, sadly, if that is what you do past a certain point, that's what you're associated with. And so it becomes harder, even trying to be an advocate, to do different things. So as I say, advocate for your stories and find allies. Also make sure that you can be versatile and do other things that don't necessarily get you typecast. What I would suggest is find the common link that allows you to pivot a story about sports to being a story about politics or culture or health, for example. There's always a way in which a story has multiple dimensions, as I was just saying with the marijuana stuff, right? There were these heated debates in Denver and different communities around Denver at the time over how the economics of this were going to work. You couldn't use credit cards because banks were not going to allow financial transactions dictated on marijuana to go through their systems. That would be a federal crime. And so there were all these issues that were kind of political. And I found myself doing very political stories over the implementation of Amendment 64 through the pot thing. So kind of tying those two things together, being able to do that, to sort of extricate from the pot story something that was about something else, allowed me to kind of pivot and show, display, have on my resume, vocalize to the newsroom during meetings that I could do these other things. And so doing that more and more frequently allowed their view of me to change. As well, he's been pitching just pot stories, but now he's pitching more political stories. Even if they're like, a step removed from pot, they're still political stories. And it's it's a different style of story. So showing versatility in that regard, I would say, is the important thing. And it requires creativity to find that angle of a story that makes it different. What I would suggest is find people who do that well. We were just talking about Jamel Hill. She's often on a sports radio show podcast that I listen to frequently, the Dan Le Batard Show. It's based in Miami. Dan Le Batard is someone who, he does sports. It's about sports, but then you listen to the conversation, and between like the stats and the jokes, they get into very serious conversations about race, about ethics, about culture. He has interesting guests on, very often like Jamel, that can tell a story about what's happening in the world in which sports is the root, but what flowers from it is something that defies the conventional wisdom about what sports can be kind of pigeonholed in. Does that make sense? I hope it does. Yeah.
Hi, thank you for being here. My name's Fernanda Figueroa. I'm based in Austin, Texas. And you were mentioning the fake uncle, and I thought it was funny because my uncle was the reason I became a journalist, but he was related to me.
No. You haven't blown up on me.
No, we all have that uncle. But I just, because you were talking about being in an environment where like your supervisors don't like allow you to grow or help you move up. for like early career journalists who can't afford to leave that place because just inflation and the place you're living in? Like, what advice do you have to kind of just be able to stay there without like hating the profession?
It was too easy. It was T-ball. What I would say is, I assume you went to school for journalism, something related to journalism. Yeah. So you learned all sorts of skills there about writing, about how to ask questions, interviewing, ethics, questions of how to gather facts. What you don't necessarily learn in school is perhaps almost as valuable, and that is dealing with people. The politics and the navigating power in a newsroom, that's something that requires an edification outside of journalism that could serve you through life. How to manage a difficult boss is, I mean, there are books written about that stuff. It's what I would suggest is, Robert Greene is one of my favorite authors. You write his name down, Greene. He writes about power. He writes about mastery, how to master a craft. He is brilliant in so many ways. And he drills down on how to view personal interactions as a game. What I would say is that if you're stuck in that situation with no immediate foreseeable exit, plan that exit for the long term. But in the short term, play that game. Because if you choose not to, you're still going to be miserable. So at least the game makes it, and to see it as a game makes it more fun. I think going back to what I said earlier about building resilience, focus on what you can control in the situation. And sadly, that requires a lot of personal reflection, reminding yourself why you're doing what you're doing, and then creativity, finding different ways to approach a situation in which maybe you're not as valued as you feel you could be. I would never speak poorly of people that I worked for or worked with, because it's not to my advantage long term. But nevertheless, what I would say is that when I've been in those situations with perhaps an employer who valued you more as cheap labor than as an actual individual with aspirations and gifts, you have to see them in a way as a tool to facilitate whatever your next step is. What value can I gather from this person? What can they teach me? And sometimes you have to strain to see what that value is, but nevertheless, I guarantee you there's value there, if only in that it teaches you how to deal with a difficult person. Because the fact is, no matter what station you arrive at in life, you're going to have to deal with people that disagree with you, that maybe even dislike you. And winning them over and charming them, or even just learning how to cope with them, is a skill that will last you all of your days on this earth.
I'm Michael Lee. I was a Salt Lake Tribune. And I had one super quick question and then a legitimate question. But I guess I really wanted to know when you found out that that guy was not your uncle. And then the second one, again, more legitimate, is, you talked a little bit about your start at very hyper-local news station. And, I'm curious, especially in kind of a time where a lot of journalists are getting burnt out really easily due to lower pay, due to, like you mentioned, not feeling valued in their newsroom. I'm curious how you feel about the sustainability of, a lot of that old school mindset of you should start out at your hyper-local newspaper or your hyper-local, TV station and then start moving up.
Sure.
Curious how you feel.
So I honestly don't remember when I found out that he wasn't my uncle. I wasn't as crestfallen as you might imagine. But to answer your question, it's a conundrum because there are two dynamics at play. If I was graduating now, I would not send my tape to Redding, California, because there are, and this is specifically in the context of TV, but I think it's analogous to other mediums, there are places hiring younger journalists now right out of school that didn't back then. So it's way more accessible to start out in a newsroom. Like when I was at Syracuse last week, they were telling me that people were getting jobs like in Baltimore and in other bigger markets, like top 50 markets out of school, which back then was unheard of. But that also is dangerous and a trap, because even though it's attractive, your chance of growing there is lower. And the reason why is because going to that tiny market in the middle of nowhere allows you to fail without as high a precipitous drop. If you go to a bigger network and you fail there, it's much more costly. You get more typecast, maybe responsibility gets taken from you. It's a much higher wire to cross. And if mediocrity is accepted there, that's not something you want either, because you want the most strenuous critique of your work so that you can get better. What I would say is chase that skill, chase a place where the work generally is of a high caliber, because you will get better, and that will make you appeal to other outlets. I was asked by a student last week how I gathered the patience to go. It's been like 15 years since I graduated college to now. How did I have the patience to wait that long to get to where I want to be? And I was like taken off by the question. I was like, patience? Like, to me, it didn't seem like patience. To me, every step of the journey kind of scared me, because I was challenging myself every step of the way. I was doing stuff that I wasn't sure I could do, in part because that's how I would get better. And the fact is, if a genie had popped out of a soda can and said to me, what's your wish? And I had said back in 2009 when I graduated from Syracuse, I want to be a White House correspondent for CNN. And they had sent me there, I would have failed immediately, because it required all of those years of building skills to be able to go in front of a camera without a script, without any awareness of what Donald Trump was going to tweet at the last minute as I was there at the podium, and the ideas that I had gathered to talk about North Korea policy suddenly turned into talking about his attacks on the cast of Hamilton or NFL players or whatever. That dexterity to be able to do that in front of the brightest lights in the world, with people talking in your ear as you're speaking out loud and putting together coherent sentences, I would have crumbled. I'm still in awe. For example, yesterday we were live, and I kid you not, I was set to interview a congressman from Missouri about immigration policy. And as I'm walking to the desk to sit down and interview him, I'm told shots have rung out at the victory rally in his home state for the Kansas City Chiefs. And that's all I'm told. And then I sit down, and as I sit, I introduce him, and I have to figure out, how am I going to connect all these dots and weave immigration back into this conversation? I was the one who told him that there had been a shooting. He had no idea. So how am I going to gather information from someone who really doesn't know anything? You have to be creative, but you also have had to have been there before. And so all that repetition from going the long way helps, as opposed to getting there right away and then kind of being like, all right, I got to figure this out now. What I would say is, it's as I said, it's a conundrum. What I would say is my axiom is, especially early on, value skills, the skills you acquire, over pay and prestige and comfort. Because if you gather the skills that other people don't have, long term, it makes you a far more appealing candidate. It makes you more competitive for jobs that go beyond whatever dreams you had early on. Or if you had told me you're going to have an opportunity to be a weekend anchor at the #1 station in Miami when you're this age out of college, I would have said, let's do it right now. But what I realized by doing it over and over and seeing people who did it better than me was, I could do that. That's not that far. I just need a little bit more polish. I'm not that far from that, And I hope that generally that's something that you take from our conversation today, that whatever your wildest hopes and dreams are, they may not be as inaccessible as they seem when you're at a point of frustration, perhaps working in a situation where you don't feel as valued as you should be, or you don't feel like you're learning as much as you should.
Last question from Caroline.
Yes. Hi, my name is Caroline Colvin. I write for HR Dive. I'm a DEI reporter and also a Newhouse alum.
Oh, yeah, cool.
My question is about newsroom politics and diversity within the newsroom. So, like, a year into me being a DEI reporter, like, my company started like a DEI committee. And so of course I was like, naturally I want to be a part of that. And as we all know about committees, there's a lot of talking and not enough action. And like a lot of our speakers have talked about like DEI buy-in from management and then like prompting them to action. But I guess my question is about accountability. So like being a part of the Widening the Pipeline Fellowship, I want to widen the pipeline. I want to bring more journalists of color like into business reporting, which is what I do, and like into my newsroom specifically. But I guess I'm kind of grappling with like, if it's not the most inclusive environment, if the pay isn't equitable, which is like something that I've tried to talk to management about and they're not really open about it. How do you figure out if you should keep pushing, or if it's like this newsroom is like so entrenched in like systems of power and they're not willing to change? Like, how do you know when you should keep pushing versus like move on possibly?
That's a very good question. I think you should always keep in your back pocket the idea of going somewhere else. It's important to make sure that you're never completely closed off to the idea, in part because you need the perspective, right? I think that it's very difficult to discern whether you, in a certain situation, you can make a difference or not, and as an individual. What I would suggest is to, if they are there, find the allies that either have been there longer or have been in similar situations before, seek their counsel, approach decision makers as a team, as a unit, and see the kind of feedback that you get. If the feedback that you get is a closed door, that's an answer in itself. If the feedback that you get is a dialogue that seems perhaps frustrating and not to the ends that you wanted, but it seems constructive and it seems like there might be a pathway toward the future, keep digging and try to find, again, the potential incentive for the decision makers. And there is no driver quite like commerce. So if you can sort of sway them with the idea that they are going to find something of value, whether economically you'll reach a new audience, or in prestige, will win awards, they'll see, look at the awards that this other organization won by doing this kind of work, look at this recognition that makes them stand out, that makes them a more appealing place. That's within our capacity. Why don't we aspire to that? Again, it's sort of like finding leverage, finding the examples in other places, but it is much more difficult to make that case when you're alone. So building that kind of community, that kind of perspective from others is invaluable.
Thank you.
Of course.
Helped reconnect me with my why.
Oh.
And reminded me of why when I walked into a newsroom in 1986 and everything was stacked against me and nobody wanted me there, why I'm still in the business today. This conversation has been incredibly insightful and inspiring, and I want to thank you for taking time out to join the Widening the Pipeline program, and let's show Boris.
Thank you so much. Much appreciated.